You fellers remind me of the story Hank was telling me about old Bauman back in 1850. It was told by none other than Teddy Roosevelt, and he even wrote it down in his book.
I'm not sure I can tell it like Josh could. Yeah, but he's right. It was told by Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy spent a lot of time in that wilderness and was a hard man to fool with a tall tale. And he said the story was told to him by an old weather-beaten hunter by the name of Bauman, I think it was.
Something just killed my dog.
Something killed your dog?
My dog went flying through the air over the tree, and I don't know how it did it.
Okay.
Deep in Bigfoot territory. Episode 19, The Bauman Story. This is a Squatch Mafia documentary. Welcome to this episode of Bigfoot territory. Today, we are going to venture into the wilderness of Montana and take a closer look at the perhaps most famous Bigfoot story from the 19th century. The so-called Bauman story, sometimes also referred to as the Montana Incident, is very likely the first widely distributed modern tale of a Bigfoot encounter with early American pioneers and one of the best-known Bigfoot stories of the pre-1950s era. The reasons for the fame of the story are not only the nightmarish events of a deadly Bigfoot attack in the mountains of Montana in the early 1800s, but even more so, the source from which the story originates. Theodore Roosevelt was not only Assistant Secretary of War, Governor of New York State, and the 26th President of the United States, among other things. He was also an avid outdoorsman, hunter, deputy sheriff, war veteran, and passionate boxer. In 1893, he published a book entitled The Wilderness Hunter, in which he recounted experiences from his life as a frontiersman in North Dakota in the 1880s. One of the episodes in the book became famous in the Bigfoot community and is known as the Bauman story. Let us take a look at the story as it happened according to US President Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt is one of the most fascinating personalities in American history. Founder and leading member of the legendary Rough Riders Cavalry, veteran of the Spanish-American War, and the 26th President of the United States. In one of his most legendary appearances, he gave a 90-minute speech after being shot by a gunman in 1912, with the bullet still in his belly during the entire speech. In his early years, Roosevelt was a feared boxer and wrestler at Harvard University. Around 1883, he started to roam the western frontier, spending his time as a hunter and outdoorsman, farmer, and even deputy sheriff at one point. Around 20 years before he became president, Roosevelt tried his hand at ranching in the wilds of North Dakota until the blizzards of 1886 to 87 wiped out most of his cattle herd. One of his books from these formative years, entitled The Wilderness Hunter, and published in 1893, contains an account as told to Roosevelt by an elderly frontiersman, describing nightmarish and deadly events in the Bitterroot Mountain Range region in Montana during the early 1800s. The old mountain man, who Roosevelt only introduces to the reader as Bauman, is described as an old, grizzled, weather-beaten mountain hunter who had lived all his life on the frontier. According to Roosevelt, the old hunter and trapper was of German heritage and had seen about all there was to see while living a life in the wild. There are no other details about Bauman mentioned in the book, but Roosevelt, who himself surely was not easy to impress, must have had some degree of belief in Bauman's tale to include the story in his book. And when we consider the kind of companions young Teddy had in his early years on the western frontier, people like Ben Lilly, for example, who themselves were legendary trappers and mountain men, and the life these early frontiersmen lived in the west of the early 1800s, it is even more remarkable how impressed Roosevelt was by Bauman. The old man told the story to Roosevelt most likely in the early or mid-1880s, and the events allegedly occurred when Bauman himself was in his 20s, so we can assume that the story took place around 1840 or earlier, when men like Jim Bridger or liver-eating Johnson still relentlessly scoured the untamed lands of the West for pelts. The events the old trapper spoke of occurred in the Bitterroot mountain range of Montana and Idaho, in the wilderness near the Wisdom River, a place that today is known as the Big Hole. According to Bauman, he and another hunter were trapping in the Idaho and Montana region already for months and were looking for better hunting grounds. The two men decided to travel deeper into the wilderness of western Montana, a place that was nearly undiscovered in the early 19th century. The area was notorious among the frontiersmen, and ghost stories about cannibalistic Indian tribes and gigantic wild animals circulated among the trappers of the region. As Bauman and his companion ventured further into the western wilderness, they became aware of a story told among the trappers and hunters, which happened only a few months ago. They were told that most hunters avoided the area and believed the place was haunted. A few months ago, a group of miners returned from their claim in the Bitterroot Mountains. As they passed a camp of a trapper, the miners had already met the man at his campsite a few days earlier and wanted to visit the trapper in his hut on their way back into civilization. But the men found the hut and the campsite completely destroyed and devastated. The trapper appeared to be beaten to death inside the remains of his hut, and his body was badly mutilated. Roosevelt writes that the miners also spoke of enormous human-like footprints all around the campsite. Since then, the region was avoided by most hunters and trappers, as the story spread among the frontiersmen of the remote wilderness of western Montana. Still, Bauman and his companion were not to be deterred by the stories told of the area and ventured deep into the remote backcountry of the Bitterroot Mountains. They continued to ride for days, moving campsites from one creek to another in search of satisfactory places to place their beaver traps. One afternoon, days after they had met another person, the two men reached a remote valley, which seemed to be a good spot for trapping beavers, and the men decided to stay in the valley for a few days. They made a quick lean-to shelter, and with a few hours of daylight left, made their way up the creek to scout. When they returned to their camp later at dusk, they found it totally destroyed, and their belongings scattered all over the place. Assuming that their camp was destroyed by a bear, Bauman started to clean up the place while his companions started to search for tracks of the bear around the campsite. But what the man found shocked both of the trappers. The tracks he found could not have been made by a bear, for they were bipedal, large, human-like footprints. The men were confused and baffled, but decided it would be best to rebuild the campsite and prepare for the night. After hours, the hunters finally fell asleep, but it would not be a restful night. Sometime before dawn, Bauman was awakened by the sound of breaking branches at the nearby tree line. He realized a strong, foul-smelling odor coming from the tree line that had engulfed the entire campsite. Bauman woke up his companion, and the two men stared into the dark forests around them as they realized a big hulking shape looming in the tree line next to the campsite. Bauman took his rifle and fired at the creature in the darkness, but whatever it was fled back into the night. The men built up a large fire and sat up the rest of the night. The next morning, they stayed close together and worked their traps during the day. As they returned to camp in the early evening, they found the site again destroyed and smashed up. The men decided to leave the area immediately the next morning and built a huge fire for the coming night. Throughout the night, they did not see the creature but heard strange howlings and screams from the forests around the valley. But nothing came close to the large campfire of the men. Finally, they fell asleep. In the morning, with the sun shining brightly, the trappers felt a bit foolish for letting their fears get the best of them, and agreed to collect their traps from the valley before making preparations to leave the area. The men again ventured out into the valley and checked their traps. After a while, only a few traps were left to collect, and the men decided that Bauman should go to gather the few remaining traps, while his companion went back to camp to begin preparations for leaving the area. When Bauman, after he had collected the traps, finally returned to the campsite, he found it empty. But after searching the campsite for a moment, he found the dead body of his companion. The neck of the man was obviously broken, and the body apparently flung around the campsite by a powerful animal. But besides that, the body seemed to be intact, so he was not taken as prey. Bauman paused only briefly to survey the scene, trying to make sense of what had happened, and then, taking only his rifle, he fled the camp, leaving all traps and supplies behind. He made it to where the horses of the men had been tied, and fled the valley as fast as he could. At this point, the tale in Roosevelt's book ends. As said before, Bauman was an old man as he told the story to Roosevelt, and he and his story must have made an impression on the future president to include the tale in his book. Neither Bauman nor Roosevelt himself made any mentions of what they believed the creature was, nor what truly happened to the unnamed companion. Also, they didn't speak of wild man, which would have been the equivalent term to Bigfoot back then, or other comparable names. But the tale of the old trapper, of course, has all the hallmarks of a classic Bigfoot encounter story. The large human-like tracks that were mentioned numerous times in the story, the large hulking creature in the tree line, the foul-smelling odor, and the sounds of tree knocks or breaking branches are all details that are known from countless modern-day Bigfoot stories. It seems very unlikely that Bauman or Roosevelt himself had knowledge of these phenomena, or were making them up by coincidence. The Bitterroot Mountains stretch along the border between Idaho and Montana, and ghost stories have been coming from this remote mountain range until our time. Also, some Sasquatch sightings are reported from Montana to this day. The desolate mountain range, with its valleys and deep forests, is covering approximately 24,000 square miles, and could, of course, be prime Sasquatch habitat. The region is still sparsely populated, and there are only few settlements in the mountains. Historically, the Bitterroot Mountains were part of the territories of the Bitterroot Salish of Montana, formerly called Flathead Indians by Europeans, until they were forced into the Flathead Reservation in 1891. They used the Bitterroot Mountains as seasonal hunting grounds. The stories and folklore of the Bitterroot Salish, or Flathead Indians, includes tales of large, hairy men living in remote and inaccessible forests and mountains. There is no traditional documented name for this Bigfoot-like creature in the Bitterroot region, but the neighboring Thompson River Salish speak of a creature they call Tsiatko, a wild and hairy giant who lives in the wilderness, and sometimes attacks hunters when they enter the creature's territory. The Bauman story from Theodore Roosevelt's The Wilderness Hunter is, of course, just one of many Bigfoot tales from the 19th century. From the end of the 18th century on, as the first European settlers moved westward, stories of encounters with so-called wild men were documented and published all over the North American continent, from New York to California, and from Florida to the Pacific Northwest. See the links in the video description for various other Bigfoot territory episodes on stories from the 19th century. There are a few more odd myths surrounding Teddy Roosevelt and Bigfoot. One story is that Roosevelt killed a Bigfoot during one of his hunting expeditions. Another says Roosevelt once had a face-to-face encounter with the creature. If any of these things actually happened, there is no evidence. By all official accounts, Roosevelt never claimed to have seen a Bigfoot and never tracked nor shot one. But these are, of course, just the official accounts. However, there is one more documented story about Theodore Roosevelt and Bigfoot. This story is also included in The Wilderness Hunter and is, even if far less known than the Bauman story, not less interesting, and this time, indeed experienced by Roosevelt himself. During a hunting trip in the state of Washington, Roosevelt and a friend hired a Native American to guide them into a remote region. Their guide urged them to avoid a particular area due to certain beliefs of the tribe elders, which Roosevelt held as utterly preposterous. He bullied the apprehensive guide into taking them to this forbidden area and demanded to pass the exact spots the tribe elders had spoken about. The hunting party did not see any sign of big game during their trip through the forbidden wilderness, but Roosevelt later indeed wrote a remarkable note about the hunting trip. During the night, while camping in the forbidden area, the hunting party heard unusual noises in the distance. Roosevelt described them as shrill screams and wrote that the sounds left on him an alarming feeling. He gave the distinct impression that they were unusual in his learned experience and found them to be unsettling, which is for sure odd, coming from an outdoorsman and adventurer like Roosevelt. Also, he stated that the creature responsible for the screams had to be enormous and that he had no idea what sort of animal could produce such noises. So, maybe there is a chance that the future US president experienced more than he wrote about or spoke about in public. What is your opinion on the Bauman story as it is recounted by Teddy Roosevelt? Do you think it's a credible account? Let me know in the comments. Hit the like button if you have enjoyed this episode of Bigfoot Territory. Subscribe to the Squatch Mafia channel at YouTube for more videos on Bigfoot and Sasquatch. Check out Squatch Mafia at Patreon and TikTok for extra content. Thank you for watching.